Hey, what's up?
Hey, we're just restarting. You're in a good Wi-Fi environment, are you? Are you in a good Wi-Fi?
Phone has trouble connecting and it'll disconnect ever so often, but it should be good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, if you can be in Wi-Fi instead of LT, that might be better, or whatever one's stronger. But let me just start it again. Cause I mean, I could link together the last episode. This isn't live. I can string segments,
Okay.
but I'll just start it again. So I'll just do a brief introduction, then I'll trim it. So this is Fam Electric Ghost, and we have on the line Schmitt Show, and it's Ezekiel from Schmitt Show. And like I said before, we've been interviewing indie artists from around the world since 2018. We've got about 24,000 listeners worldwide, and we're happy to have Schmitt Show on the program tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me, dude.
Cool.
It's the first time I've been on a podcast.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool world. I mean, as an indie musician myself, I got into this because I actually was interviewed on a podcast. I actually went and paid to be on a podcast. And then I said, like a couple of years ago, I said, well, that's not cool. Why should I have to pay? Right. And I love other musicians. I've been talking to musicians around the world. And I say, there's got to be a way to do this where you don't have to charge a musician because, musicians have a hard time making money in the first place.
Right.
So I said, and then this anchor thing came along, and it was been a really cool way to get in touch with people in our industry and find out what's going on in all genres. So the first question I always ask is like, when do you first get into music? Like what age?
I was about 13 and a half when I first started working on music.
Cool. So
I
how did you get into it? Were you inspired by somebody in your family or somebody you saw on TV?
Well, I grew up around music because my dad is a producer for since he was in his 20s, and he also played for the worship team at my church and everything when I was growing up. And so I was always around it. I had a little bit of knowledge of it, but didn't really get into it until when I was trying to become a video game programmer when I was like 12. I was making little games and stuff like that, and I needed background music. So I figured, well, I don't really have anything that I can put on there, so I'll just make something. So I went on to GarageBand, started fiddling with loops, and then my dad got me a piano program to teach me how to play piano, so that way I could learn to how to write my own music. And from there, started getting like books on music theory and stuff like that. And it just kind of kept on going.
Have you always been somebody that used like a DAW, like a GarageBand, or use Pro Tools or any of the digital audio workstations, or do you use like MIDI keyboards or controllers, or how do you record your electronic music?
Well, I rely heavily on a DAW, but since I do not play the piano a little bit, I'm not the greatest of musicians. I'm more of like I can compose something rather than play it out. Usually I have my MIDI controller, or right now I have my microKORG right in front of me, and I use that to play in MIDI for what I'm trying to write, and then I'll go and correct it, at timing or.
Hey, so we'll just continue where we were.
Sorry, I
yeah. So you
hit the button when I was messing with my phone.
Yeah, keep it hands free from your phone. Don't hit the low
Yeah.
Yeah, so we were talking about how you use the microKORG as your MIDI controller, and you still use GarageBand, or you use a different DAW?
I started off with GarageBand, and I used that for a couple of years. It's a great, beginner's DAW to kind of get you used to the workflow and everything. But my dad had Logic on his computer, and then he let me work on it for a little bit, and I was like, man, I really love this.
Yeah.
And so he got me my own copy, and I started transitioning slowly from GarageBand to Logic, because it was a lot harder going from something that was super simple to something that's actually really powerful, a powerful DAW. And that took a couple of years, but I'm pretty much I'll use Logic Pro X these days.
That's interesting, because I'm a keyboardist. I'm a modular synthesis, so my whole history in music is I'm in my 50s, and the new wave movement was like very impressive to me. And then I like bands like Yes and Genesis, and
Oh,
so I'm a synthesist. I have like Jupiters, I have Prophets, I've got modular Moogs, and so
lucky.
yeah. So I grew up being impressed with Pete Townsend, Keith Emerson, Bernie Worrell, bands like Sun Ra. So I'm coming from that side. I in this modern era, from hip hop musicians to EDM artists and DJs. The DAW has become like an equalizer, allowing producers to get into the game where before you had to have, people had to be musicians. They had to know how to play guitar. Most of the bands I was started with back in the day in the 80s were all, guitar-based bands. And I would always try to convince them to bring a Roland in. And it's hard to get a punk band to want to have be playing a Jupiter. And they're really like, well, I don't want that.
Right.
But I was kind of always a big proponent of bands like Joy Division and Depeche Mode, and saying that you can be impressive in electronic music. You can be aggressive. You can be like Trent Reznor. You can show that you can hang with the guitar players. I mean, that was the whole idea of what Keith Emerson was able to do. And so electronic music has always kind of pushed the limits. I've got sequencers all over the place because I'm a one-man band. When I play live shows, but it is an interesting world. I've tried to stay away from the DAW because I'm kind of a purist, but I mean, I've been getting closer into it. I've been looking more like Akai's, Akai MPCs, Forces, things like that, or still kind of a hardware guy. So I kind of am leaning toward like a DAW-less DAW, like an Akai Force or an MPC-1, things like that. But it's just interesting.
I feel that.
Yeah, just to be able to still control it. Control freak. But
DAWs are awesome, but they don't have that spur of the moment improbability that you do with like hardware, where you can adjust settings on the go as you're working with it, and has that authentic sound rather than something that's like made on a computer. You know what I mean? There's a certain warmth to analog hardware, rather than
like a Jupiter and a Moog.
A simulation.
Yeah, it's like I was going to ask you what type of sounds you're emulating on some of your your new album. I was looking at your album, Fractal Flowers, and I was listening to songs like Blue and Drifting Home, and I was like, and I can hear sounds that I have Moogs, I've got Prophets, I've got real Rollers. I'm like, oh, so I wonder what you're emulating, because I can hear that it could be like a Prophet 5, or it could be like a Jupiter a Juno 106. I'm just wondering, like, what type of plugins do you like to use, or what are you using for your synth sounds?
Well, mostly I heavily rely on Omnisphere that I got a few years back, because it has a huge library of like all of my favorite synths. Like it has all of like the original Rolands, all the Moogs, and all, like it even has a couple of the Prophet 5, which sounds so nice on.
Yeah, the Prophet 5.
But usually
it's a dream synth.
Oh, for real. Usually I'll use those as like, because I can use the sample sounds, and then I'll start from there, and then I'll build from like the original waveform, and then build off of those. But typically like Moog, or it's the Jupiter.
So the Moog, are you talking about the mini Moog sounds, or like modular Moog, like System 55?
Sometimes I use the modular Moog when I'm going for more of the
old school,
more experimental sounds, especially on like my more ambient ones.
Yeah, because that's where the world I'm in is like, I got a mother 32, a DFAM, and a grandmother, and they have the spirit of like the System 33s and 55s. If you know what those are the ones that like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer used, and they have a certain sound to them that those old type of VCOs, not the DCOs, but the totally analog oscillators. And the one thing about those is, like, when you're doing stuff in the DAW, can you like cause like what happens with the Moog is when you turn it on, it warms up. So it changes what those VCOs sound like. Can you age your VCO emulations? Can you like age them and detune them and get them to sound like a 72 Moog, or are you kind of stuck with what their bass sounds are?
On Omnisphere, you kind of can manipulate a little bit, but you can't get the authentic, warmth that an analog one has. But it has like an analog knob that you can turn it up or down. It kind of gives similar feel.
Yeah,
but it doesn't have the same. I don't know. It just hits your ear different.
That's interesting, because I do appreciate a lot of the electronic music you're doing on Fractal. I mean, I really like what you're doing there. And you know, I really listening to Blue a lot. I like the sound on that. I've always been a big proponent of you know, electronic music in people putting it to the long form, because you have an album that's an hour and 39 minutes, and I've always been, you know, I'm a progressive rocker at heart, you know, like
Hmm.
you know, bands like, you know, Genesis, like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, you know, big rock operas. Um,
Yeah.
that have all these heavy analog synths and Hammond B3s and all this elaborate stuff going on. And I like the fact that you kind of have the room in your album to stretch out and do a lot of cool things. Do you find in today's world with the 3 minute single or the 2 minute single and Spotify playlists that don't have central themes, um, you're still kind of doing an old form in terms of the way you do your albums because it's
Yeah.
psychedelic.
I was very heavily influenced by the concept albums, the like Pink Floyd and stuff.
Yeah.
Like I love how they would like the entire album. Each song sounds different, but they always carry a theme that basically tells a story throughout the album, and
Oh
you can
yeah.
feel the flow through it. Like, because I'm someone that listens to music like all day. Because when I'm at work, I'm a cook. All I have to do really is
Oh
just
yeah.
chop
You
up
get
stuff, and I have the radio
you get
playing.
to you put
So
your iPod on.
exactly, I just get on the Bluetooth and I'll hit an album and I'll listen to the thing all the way through. So I do enjoy, like, you know, those kind of more poppy, like 2-3 minute songs. You know, it's kind of gets you, you know, a nice little vibe. But I prefer something that's going to carry me through the day. You know what I mean? Something that, you know, can keep my attention
Yeah,
and, you know,
that's interesting that you
like
mentioned
pull on.
Pink Floyd. I saw a documentary on the Dark Side of the Moon, and they were talking about like how they wrote that album. And then I also saw one on Wish You Were Here. And the interesting thing, you know, you got the, you know, the Pink Floyd everybody knows is that the Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here,
Hmm.
The Wall. Some people don't remember the Sid Barrett version.
Hmm.
And some of your music kind of reminds me of some of the Sid Barrett Pink Floyd stuff, which is the earlier stuff. And I do hear, you know, the one, you know, the Wall, or the, you know, the version of Pink Floyd that became the popular progressive band, where finally a progressive band broke through, became like mega popular. But when they
Hmm.
started, they were kind of like MGMT, where MGMT is trying to
Yes.
be like them. And the Sid Barrett version was really psychedelic. And
Yes.
I
Like
do
Echoes,
hear
one of my
I do
favorite
yeah I do
songs.
yeah I do hear some of that. Are you more inspired by the Sid Barrett version of the band, or the more you know, the version everybody knows?
See, I prefer the Sid Barrett version solely because of the it was more instrumental feeling, you know what I mean? There was less lyrics. It felt more what's the
Yeah,
word I'm looking for?
it's really
More,
progressive. You know, it's a
yeah.
true progressive rock band. Is which
Yeah.
kind of was the problem with progressive rock bands, that they go on stage and do 20-minute songs with time changes, and they're in, you know, maybe turn their back to the audience and focus on the music. And you had to really be a fan of that. You know, weren't a lot of
Hmm.
theatrical things going on, other than the fact they were putting all their energy into playing. You know,
Yeah.
you ever saw Yes or Genesis, like the Peter Gabriel Genesis, is very much the
Hmm.
same thing. You know, they got these 8 minute, 10 minute, 12 minute songs with key changes, and they're very elaborate. They're doing things that you wouldn't do in a normal rock song. It's a mixture of
Yeah.
jazz, classical, and rock. And I've always been a big proponent of that. You know, that's where I live in my music, and I do hear that in your music, because you'll have songs that are like synth wave or new wave type of songs, but then you have these instrumental songs like your latest single. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that's really cool, because I like being able to stretch out as a musician, and you know, the progressive, you
Exactly.
know, rock form, I think, gives you the ability to do that. You know, even though it might be
Definitely.
not be popular today, but you know, I do see bands like MGMT, they do that. You know, Radiohead, they do that. You know, Wilco, they do that. So
Hmm.
you do have bands that are able to break through and still keep that tradition. So who would you say are your reference points besides like Pink Floyd?
Um, well, for my more electronic, like EDM based stuff, I would say Infected Mushroom and Terrafractal are my two heaviest influences.
Mm-hmm.
Infected Mushroom was the first psytrance band that I ever listened to. My brother showed it to me, when I was a kid, and I just fell in love with psytrance from then, because that was the only thing the only type of music I had other than like gospel and some like 70s Christian rock, because that's all my dad would let me listen to when I was really little. So I didn't have much of a frame of reference to anything that was out in the world besides, I had some folk albums, I had classical music, and then I had my brother's electronic music. And so Infected Mushroom and Terrafractal were the first ones I started listening to. And Infected Mushroom's more experimental, melodic style really caught me. And Terrafractal, he is a brilliant composer and a classically trained musician, and so he works classical music into his EDM, and it just flows so beautifully, and it got me more into the actual more composing side of music rather than just kind of putting nice beats and loops together like a lot of EDM artists kind of do.
Yeah,
at least sounds like.
Yeah, I wouldn't label you an EDM. You're more like electronic, experimental electronic, psychedelic, psytrance, which the synthwave movement, because that's the one thing that really killed me as a musician. That I went to New York and I played a show in this club, and they were surprised I had all this gear, because they think like all electronic musicians just have a CDJ. And like, no, I actually have Moogs, and I got a sound check just like any rock band.
Yeah.
And it's like, it was kind of like, it was back then, it was harder to, the world was changing so much where bands only had to have an SD card and CDJ, and you didn't really have to have anything else. But now the world's changing. I mean, I just got signed by a booking agent to do the kind of electronic stuff I do, and to do live shows and do online shows and stuff. So there is a new, like, it seems like people want to see bands that actually are going to play full progressive, pure, electronic music started what you're doing and what I do, and a lot of other bands I've interviewed is not what the DJs do. Not that that's not cool, but it's a different type of music. You want to write songs. Your music are songs, not just beats or clips strung together. You're trying to compose a song. So what made you want to go that direction when there's so much, like, a lot of artists that are going like the clip-based, pure dance-oriented electronic music? What made you want to write songs?
I would say it came from mostly just me doing lots of research, because when I first started off, since I didn't know anything about music, I was like, well, if I want to actually learn how to write stuff, I might as well do it the kind of more scientific way and learn like music theory and stuff. And I was learning from there on like how to actually build like tension and release and how to put emotion into your music. And I was like, hey, this is way better than just doing that simple A-B bridge format that a lot of people do. I wanted to create something that reminded me more of like Vivaldi, with like the four seasons. Like, it's just 4 songs, but they're like 12 to 20 minutes long, and they evolve and give you a sense of the feeling of the seasons and stuff. Because my dad was an art teacher, and so I always had art books and philosophy books laying around. So I was always interested by like putting meaning into your art, and like how I could do that as an instrumental artist. Because for the longest time, I didn't like the way my voice sounded, so I wouldn't sing or put any of my vocal samples onto my music. So I had to figure another way to put emotion and meaning into my music.
So you focused on just instrumentals first because you didn't like your voice? Yeah, I started that way. The interesting story with the Ghost is, like, when I first started, all I did was sound paintings. And the idea of a sound painting came from an interview Hendrix had when they asked him about Electric Ladyland. If you've ever heard that album.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of the first examples of a guitar player doing what synthesizer players do. He basically was creating sound paintings and soundscapes with the guitar and effect pedals. And they asked him what it was, because they had like ocean sounds and cosmic sounds and birds and all these things. And he said it's a sound painting. I create sound paintings. I see music as pictures and painting. And I always took that as that's what a lot of electronic musicians do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Definitely, definitely.
yeah, and I think that when you go at music like that, I was trained on the clarinet, classically trained on the clarinet, but then I realized I can't really write a whole song on the clarinet. It's kind of hard. so
Mm-hmm.
so I got into synthesizers because then I was in bands and I would play keyboards with bands, but then it's like I wanted to be able to write for the band because I was a songwriter, and I just started getting like synthesizers. I found an old like beat up mini Moog, and then I found like a couple like beat up Rollins, and I fixed them because I'm an IT guy myself, and I
Mm-hmm.
started being able to write all the parts. I could do bass lines, I could do drum lines, and I could start compose. And I have a big sense of music history, and from Dylan to Coltrane to Johnny Cash. I like everything, every
I
genre
feel
there
it.
is. And so I just was just drawn to the way Bob Dylan's one of the greatest songwriters ever, greatest lyricist, maybe not the best voice, but a lyricist.
Definitely,
Like
definitely.
Pete Townsend approached synthesizers in a way that no one ever even thought to, with songs like Barbara O'Reilly or, even like Who Are You? The
Mm-hmm.
techniques he does electronically were like way ahead of what other musicians were doing, with envelope followers and all kinds of cool stuff he would do on the ARP 2600. And it's just the idea of electronic music is that you push the envelope, but you do want to construct these sound patterns. You do want to construct these
Mm-hmm.
ambient concepts. They go back, bands like Tangerine Dream, and
I love Tangerine Dream so
yeah,
much.
yeah. It's just that idea. If you get the craft work and
Yes,
Brian
yes.
Brian Eno's work with Bowie on Low and Heroes and stuff like that. It's just the kind of advanced thinking in music has always been where I've been drawn to. So I'll be drawn to a Hendrix or drawn to a Bernie Worrell or drawn to Sun Ra or drawn to Coltrane, what they do, And
Mm-hmm.
I just think a lot of people in today's world, that was always all about beats or clips or samples. And they kind of lost what made Sgt. Pepper's a great album, what made The Wall a great album.
Mm-hmm.
Who made the Lifehouse, which became Who's Next. It was going to be another rock opera, and he couldn't finish it. But the idea, I grew up listening to the Tommies, my first rock opera, and I said, "Wow, that's amazing!" Like they actually in the story, and I just got drawn into that. And so that my whole career has been trying to replicate Quadrophenia or Tommy in different ways, but or be inspired by it. So it's interesting. You talk about rock operas, and your albums, like I said, are pretty expansive. So you were drawn into the composition from music theory, which is really interesting because you don't really hear a lot of musicians actually talk about that. They either kind of wing it, or they kind of feel it, or they don't get into that. And so that's interesting that you took it from that point of view, which is actually really cool.
Yeah, I got to a point where like I learned everything I could from music theory, like on kind of the mathematics of like fourths and fifths and going up the circle of all that shit. Sorry, didn't mean to
That's
cuss.
okay. That's okay.
But but also I think I've gotten to the point where I can kind of feel like here I know this, like I want to put on, so there's a C, I want to do I want to go up to a D sharp, and then I'm going to hit this note, and so that way I can create a certain feel. Like I can do that automatically without having to think about it as much, but I still kind of rely on like trying to, I don't know, put some more kind of like the physics aspect of it, because our brains like react to certain sounds and things in a certain way to where
Yeah.
that's how you can create emotion through music, and it's just specific formulas that you
Oh
got to
yeah.
hit to be able to hit that sound in your head.
Yeah, I've been getting into some new ideas like subharmonics. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
like whole theory of like subharmonic theories, right? And Moog just came out with this brand new instrument that's based on like the Trautonium and the Rhythmicon. And it's the mathematics of subharmonics and how you can do all
Mm-hmm.
these subdivisions. And their brand new synthesizer, it's a subdivision monster. It just does all these strange subdivision. It has like two main oscillators and four sub oscillators. And it has all
Ooh.
these strange non-Western scale capabilities. It can do a Western scale,
that
but
sounds good.
it can do all this other stuff. And so it can do this strange timing and all these like subdivisions between these like multiple sequencers that seem limiting because they're only 4-step sequencers, but because you can do the subdivisions and you can keep on breaking it down and spreading it out, you can, even though it seems like it doesn't have an advanced modern sequencer, it's not 128 step, it's not 256, it's only 2/4. With 2/4 step sequencers on an analog machine that has sub oscillators. So it's got 2 main oscillators and 4 sub oscillators, and it can do all this strange, modulation and subdivision that is like crazy. You can create rhythms that are like, is this, it's something that I've been driven into because I just love the complexity of what you can do with some of these type of, systems. And,
for real.
And
I have to check that out.
Yeah, just check it. There's Luke Pop, who's one of the big YouTubers, has a really good review of it that goes into the science of it and how it works. It's pretty cool. You can get into it, but yeah, I mean that's been the whole thing. I mean, I'm kind of an IT guy. Well, I am an IT guy, and I happen to be a musician. But electronic musicians have always kind of been the mixture of science and art and mathematics.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what synthesizers can do. So
it's a bridge between those worlds.
Yeah, and you can be very creative. I mean, you can be, Keith Emerson was, a master of modular synths. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of him in New York with these big gigantic modes, these System 55s. There's nothing but like CV wires all over him, and he had this big gigantic stack, and he would be able to make, crazy modulation. It looks like a science experiment. And that's what always drew me into electronic music. And it's strange that kind of got put into your laptop, what he used to be able to do with these big modulars. But what you kids are doing on their laptops is what he used to be able to do with that stuff. And what means it equalized it, where his rigs were like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in the 70s, and now you have some of the same capabilities on a laptop. So that kind of equalized the access to that kind of technology, which I think is really cool, because then I get to talk to bands all over the world that are now have the capability of doing synthesis that used to be kind of the gate was you had to be a Keith Emerson, you had to be a Pete Townsend, you had to be a Bernie Wall, you had to be a Herbie Hancock to get to a Jupiter 8 or an R 2600, or CS80. You couldn't get these things unless you were in the game.
Yeah.
So maybe talk about your what you call your writing style. I know you in your write-up you talk about it being psychedelic, but maybe you could talk about how you look at your album Fractal Showers. How would you describe what genres that covers and what the feeling is for that whole project?
I would say for the Fractal Showers album, it was very heavily influenced by like Solar Fields and Connect.ohm and a lot of Sybian ambient artists that I was listening to at the time, because what I consider the purpose for that album is it's a storytelling of psychedelic experiences that I've gone through, as well as like the longer tracks, or for like people to mix into like whatever they're listening to while they're also having an experience themselves, some maybe that, help them calm down if they're going through a hard trip or whatever. But I would say it's more of it's the vocal tracks are like a blend of explaining how I felt and some of the ideas and philosophies that came to me while I was, tripping balls.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like Sgt. Pepper's is the kind of experience of psychedelic to the mainstream. That whole idea. Lucy and Sky had Diamonds, and the whole psychedelic. What the Beatles did with Sgt. Pepper, they kind of created that psychedelic rock, and then you get the mood.
I was trying to get like a blend of original psychedelic rock, like I did with the song Astral, where it's just a bass, a guitar, drums, and my vocals.
Mm-hmm.
And a bunch of effects, and then some more of the kind of some of the kind of an MGMT type feel, especially with like Forgotten Agape and stuff like that, kind of more pop,
Yeah, it
pop
definitely has
psychedelic
like the
feel.
first album kind of feel. You know, they were
Yeah,
really kind of channeling Sid Barrett, Pink Floyd. Even their second album
exactly. Yeah.
is really channeling Sid Barrett, even more so than the first. The first was more like new wave, like the kind of, and the second album is more. That is really more like a Pink Floyd, Sid Barrett album. And every time I listen to it, I think they really must love Sid Barrett because that whole album channels that version of Floyd. And I do hear that in your music too. I do hear that a lot, which is cool because I don't know if all the kids today, you know, Sid's music was kind of like Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, you know, or Alex Chilton and Big Star. It's kind of like this. A lot of artists know what it is, but I don't think there's a lot of people that actually listen to it. I mean, I think the people that listen to it end up becoming famous, you know, members of bands. and created tons of bands. But I don't know how many actual fans actually bought those records.
For real.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Sometimes it's like the very important bands didn't really sell a lot.
Yeah, I've noticed that, especially lots of artists that I've listened to. They're like, I'm like, oh my God, how do these people not have more listeners? How are they not more mainstream? Then I realize it's kind of more artsy fartsy type music. Not everyone's gonna want to pop it on like their car while they're driving down the road. But for me, it's like I can listen to this all day. How are they not more famous?
Yeah,
You know?
I mean, I grew up, you know, loving like the Velvet Underground. I went and got all their records, and I read all about their history with Andy Warhol. And it was just very. And the thing about the Velvets, they really inspire like punk, like or what became alternative music. I mean, bands like REM, Smashing Pumpkins, Pearl Jam. I mean, all that grunge, all that alternative rock, it all comes from like what Lou Reed did with the Velvets. And it's just interesting. I mean, they were just such an iconic band, and they had this kind of punk aesthetic, but it had also this very eclectic kind of art rock because they were working with Warhol. So they were working with Warhol, and they had this visual stuff going on, and then they had this kind of very esoteric stuff going on. And Bowie really jumped onto it, and Bowie kind of took what Lou had done and made it work commercially. And that was always surprising. Like, there's okay, so all these ideas that Lou had in '66 and '67, Bowie in the '70s actually got it to work. It made it more theatrical, and was just he had a voice that was like, you know, superior to what Lou's voice. Like Lou was more like a Dylan, you know. But Bowie had this range in his voice, and he had that whole persona that he was able to do all this theatrical stuff that kind of pushed that Velvet stuff into a whole different zone, which is, you know, it was progressive rock and art rock and theatrical, but it had like this kind of punk bones from what Lou Reed had been doing.
Yeah.
So do you actually play live shows with your stuff, or are you primarily like a social media streaming service type of band, like a bedroom producer, or do you actually do shows?
I would love to do shows at some point. I was looking forward to getting into a few places around here this year, and then COVID hit.
Oh, so you were getting ready to try to get out there.
Yeah. And then, you know, so all my plans for this year kind of got shut down. So I just went heavily into social media, trying to spread my music through, you know, Instagram and stuff like that.
So
because that's the easiest way to communicate.
So how are you going to present yourself as your project? Were you going to use like some kind of controller, like in a Kai MPC or like a Novation Grid, or how are you going to do your work live? Did you have you figured out what you were going to do? How are you going to present your music and play it?
Well, I was thinking more along the lines for my first shows and stuff like that. Be playing more like my electronic stuff. So I'd basically just be like doing DJing. I was gonna get a was it the Pioneer? I forgot what the name of it was, but it's one of the I was gonna get a CDJ because I was going to play some shows, and then this all happened, and then rent hit when my hours got cut, so I had to use all the extra money that I'd saved up for equipment and stuff like that to pay rent. So that was a bit of a bummer.
Yeah, I mean,
But
it's interesting. Yeah, so you were going to be a one-man show. You weren't going to have like a full band. Your whole idea was still just going to be like you. You were going to run it
yeah.
like as a solo artist, right?
Hmm.
That's interesting because the one thing is like I've seen a lot of bands. There's some new technology out there now that allows you to. Even Pioneer has like grid-based controllers. They have these big grids, right? So you can use the grid to launch your clips, but then you can also use the grid to play notes, and then you can use
Hmm.
the grid to trigger things. So if you're presenting it, it's a little more dynamic than just a CDJ because you can actually
Hmm.
play it. You know, like Kai has the MPC one. They've got the Kai Force. They've got MPC Live, and it allows you to like link to like Ableton or any other DAW, and then actually control what you're playing. You're not kind of stuck in a CDJ world. You can actually integrate modular gear. You can integrate like another
Yeah,
hardware synth.
I've been I've been thinking about that lately because especially the way that I create my sounds and loops and stuff like that for my music, I can easily create something like maybe get like Machine or something like that and be able to,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
already
those
have
are.
the song structure in my head, but be able to play it out as I go,
Yeah, I think
and
it's
then
just more
I might
impressive.
swap some instruments.
Yeah, for your audience, and if you're not like a primary keyboardist, these grid-based systems like Novation and Akai and all these companies that make these, even Roly, they make these interesting, controllers that allow you to launch your clips and to actually even play chords and play notes and kick off samples and run drum machines. I've been looking at like the Akai Force, which has like song creation modes. It doesn't just do clips; you can actually build songs.
Ooh, nice.
And it's like a DAW-less controller, right? That allows you to have like it's got synth engines built into it. It's got drum machines built into it. It's got samples in it, and then it's got CV connections, so I can link my mode to it. So I could take one of my modes, like my grandmother, and bring my vocoder and maybe bring one of my Rolands, but then have that be my central control unit as a one-man band. I could be launching like 808s and 727 drum machines and
Mm-hmm.
samples and whole song structures, and then have my whole set in this machine instead of a computer. Because the one thing about computers I don't like when I go on the road is sometimes they crash, sometimes
For
they
real.
don't. Yeah, so when I've been more of a hardware guy, I go with sequencers. Like I got like an Arturia BeatStep Pro. For the last couple of years, I've used that as my central controller, which allows me to have something that's a hardware-based controller, and I can just have projects on it, and I can go and have all these sequenced drum lines and bass lines that I can control with foot pedals and other controllers, but I can override them. I can always just kick off new ones, and I can do stuff live. And so it gives me some kind of dynamic control that if I feel like playing like a true musician, I can take my song, I can just play it the way I wrote it, or I could take it and mute and unmute tracks and play over tracks and do whatever I
Mm-hmm.
want. And so it gives the audience something that feels more like a live performance, which I think some people like that. Some people don't. Some people want to just
I
hear
really
it.
love that type of stuff. Especially, like, have you ever watched Reggie Watts?
Oh yeah.
I love the because usually he just seems to have just that one looper and that and the synthesizer that he works with, but he can still create so much such a dynamic type of show out of just these simple sounds and things like that that he can manipulate to where he can be just basically a one man orchestra, and that's
Yeah,
something I would like to work up to in like once I can get more equipment and stuff like
yeah. I
that
mean,
because I'm practicing as much as I can for like piano and stuff like that to get better. But at the same time, I won't be able to really do stuff like that till I have the equipment to practice with too.
well, the
So,
non-traditional controllers really give you the ability to do electronic music like a DJ, but then they give you the ability to riff. So
mm-hmm.
you can use those grids if you ever see the MPCs. Rappers have used MPCs for years. Kanye West used them. A lot of big famous rappers back in the day, they used them because it was able to. They didn't want to have to sample everything. And
Hmm.
they did have samples, but they could build their own beats and then launch them and do live shows with and not have to depend on a DJ. And it's still even with electronic music, this whole DAW-less movement, which is a lot of gear out there now, triggered for DAW-less producers that allow us to bring that on the road. And you don't have to be the best keyboardist in the world. You don't have to be a Bernie Worrell. You don't have to be a Stevie Wonder. And you can still be an electronic musician and riff and do something different and still have your structure, which I think is cool.
Hmm.
It just gives the audience a better show, in my opinion. But
I totally understand. That's why, like, whenever I do appreciate the art form it takes to like DJ and stuff like that, but when I watch DJs that don't like have like a visual or something kind of going on, it's kind of like almost like, hey man, I could kind of do that at home as well. You know what I mean?
well, yeah,
Whereas more of just
I
like
kind of
listening to music rather than a show aspects. Like there's less
well, in order to have the
theatrics to it.
perfection, it's more like a club. It's like if you're doing a show for the dance hall crowd that wants to hear the beat, they're going to hear that consistent beat, and you're kind of like you can be on autopilot. You can have everything kind of set together on main stage or Ableton Live, and you don't really have to have a lot of interaction with your set list. You can, and what you see a lot of them doing is just jumping up and down.
Yeah.
And the audience doesn't care because it sounds good, because you can sound perfect. But the problem is, like, I grew up in the days of watching, like, going to an Allman Brothers concert, or actually I saw the Who 3 times. I saw Parlor and Funkadelic. I went to go see Herbie Hancock, and I don't want to be a jerk, but it's like I like to hear like real musicians, and it's just something about if you go and see Pete Townsend actually play it, right, or you see Herbie Hancock actually play that Moog, or
Exactly.
there's something about that's the whole thing. And I understand kids today, you can do it without that, but there's something missing to me because I grew up with it. So maybe they never
you lose
saw
the
it.
soul of it.
Yeah. But people
Have you
forget,
ever?
like, yeah, I mean, you want to hear somebody do the song a little different. I don't necessarily want to hear it the same way. I don't want to hear Rock It by Herbie Hancock. I don't need to hear it exactly the way he wrote it. I'd actually like to see him rip it.
Because you can just go get the album and listen to that. There's no point of going to a show.
Yeah, and I think some kids have maybe lost that, or they don't care about that. They just want to hear what they heard on the radio, and that's that's what they want. But it's not the same as what I grew up, going to shows and seeing, REM play their band, play the album, differently. I mean that's part of the whole point of music.
Exactly. Have you ever heard of Ott?
No. Who are they? Where are they from?
He's a UK producer, but he does all of his shows live with a bassist and a drummer. And his stuff is
I like that. I like the idea of that.
Amazing the way he flows from sound to sound to sound, just using a keyboard and just very simple setup. Well, relatively simple,
Yeah. Well, you don't have to be that complicated. I mean, you could go out with a Hammond B3 or an electric organ like the Doors, and that's pretty. You don't have to. You could just do that. I mean, people are so caught up in some of this other stuff today, but yeah, I mean, I always liked 3-piece bands. Power
exactly,
trio, or 4-piece bands that are very simple, but could do really amazing things. And it's just people have kind of lost the idea that rock kind of died. It'll come back, but it's we're in an age where people don't feel you need to have a rock band to be a band. You can just come out with a turntable and a sequencer or your MIDI controller, and that's it. But there's always going to be a place for bands that want to do more than that and want to present. So, I mean, what are your ideas about like collaborating with other artists? I always ask people, like, are you just in the stage where you're still forming your band, or you want to? Because what I see today, there's so many bands that have features. They whether they're a rock band and they bring a rapper in, or they're a hip hop artist and they bring a rock somebody in. It is all this kind of cross collaboration. jazz artists working with rappers. And
honestly, I have a lot of trouble collaborating with people unless because nowadays most people that offer to collaborate with me are like cities that are like across the country or the world. And so it's harder for me to work on by like making a little section, sending it, waiting for them to send it back. I just lose motivation and interest almost immediately. But like if I'm actually working on, I got a little band with my friend Nate. He's still learning guitar and stuff like that, but he has a huge musical knowledge and stuff like that. So when me and him work on ideas together, we come up with some amazing stuff that, still working on, haven't released any of it yet, but it's really good because I can work with someone if they're right there with me. I can flow with them, but I can't like write a song where it's like, okay, I need you to create the kick and the bass and then email it to me and I'll work on it tomorrow. It doesn't really work like that for me because I have to be like, okay, well, what key are you feeling? What are you doing right now? Like, what do you like this little bit? I need like info as I'm going rather than, wait a week to hear back from someone that, oh yeah, I got that bass line done.
That's the thing. I did a long range project back in 2017 called To Infinitum with an artist named Alter Control K. And I was in a pure like analog setup and they were in an FL studio. The only thing that kind of made it work was for some reason we were very much in sync with what our musical taste. So I would send some Moog demo and then she would just take it and do the vocals over it, and she would just like, she was really in tune with what I was doing. So she would just suddenly just riff over it or create something over it, and we would immediately have like a Skype and talk about it. And we had immediate feedback, right? I wasn't waiting like a day, 2 hours later or the next day we'd go back and adjust it. So if you have a relationship with somebody like that, if you're kind of like musical soulmates, when you send it, they kind of know what to do with it, and then you communicate. It can be done. Exactly. Else, and they were taking too long, and then they were being really kind of anal about it, about where they wanted the kick and where they want this and where they want that. And then I did lose interest because they were being kind of like, well, you're like taking all the life out of the recording.
For real.
So it's like, okay, so if it works, you have to have that kind of, with musicians, it's like, it's a feel. You got to feel that you like sync up with another person. And when you do it live, that, what you
exactly.
You can, and it's harder to do that online, but it's possible if you really sync with somebody, but it's rare. I mean, it's probably a lot harder. I haven't found somebody else like that in 3 years.
No, I totally feel that.
Yeah.
Especially what you said about like syncing musical style wise. I totally feel that because a lot of people that like they'll ask like, hey man, you want to collab or something like that? Or, I'll try working on something with them. They come from like a purely electronic musical background where I honestly barely listen to electronic music as much as I used to. Mostly I listen to like lots of classic rock, lots of Tool for some reason. I don't know why I just really like them.
Yeah. I get what you're saying.
Just different genres besides like electronic music is only a small part of my musical taste rather than the entirety of my style. You know what I mean? Well, so it's hard for me to work with someone when they're just wanting just to put out, kind of like just bangers.
But the problem I have with some electronic musicians is that, in this age compared to the old age, when you said you were electronic before, you're like Keith Emerson and you're doing a 20-minute solo. And today you got somebody that's doing like an EDM song, they got the drop, and they're very, very kind of locked into their genre. Trance has they're locked into, psytrance is this, and all the different variations of electronic music today. They get really hung up and very anal about the structure. And if somebody says, oh, maybe we should, bring a jazz phrasing into something, right? Like me, or I'll go bring a classical phrase into something, or I'll bring a punk rock thing into something. And they're like, well, that didn't really go. And I'm like, well, I'm trying to do something different.
And it might actually work better. It just is not the same formula that it's used to produce that style.
Yeah,
especially
They can't do it. They won't do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, especially like when I'm scrolling through Instagram and I hear like lots of really well produced, sounds really good, but very cookie cutter like EDM or psytrance songs because
Yeah, because some people are
they're
kind of
always
stuck in the same mode.
you got the drum roll, you got the build up, oh, here's the drop, and then oh, there's just the bass and the kick, and that's kind of like the same thing you hear in every 20 other songs. That's
Yeah,
why
and
like I have a tendency to not put in drops and stuff like that, just out of a almost a loathing of them. Not
well, I think
because
it
like
becomes
of
like
what they
this.
are, but because of how overused they are these days.
Well, it becomes like a disco formula. You know, it died for
Yes.
a reason. It died. You know,
Yes.
genres die for a reason. If you overdo the drop, it's the whole thing's gonna drop.
Exactly.
My
Exactly.
whole opinion with like electronic music, like I said, I grew up, you know, with Yes and Genesis, and Tangerine Dream, and what Sun Ra was one of the first jazz bands to use modes, and they did all these big soundscapes and these really, you know, and the jazz has always been a big influence when I try to talk to some other musicians when I'm talking to them. Listen to this jazz piece. I'll give them something from like Sun Ra Jazz and Silhouette. It's like a bebop record, but it's got all these really interesting horn parts, very elaborate layering of very complicated counter rhythms and counter melodies. And
Mm-hmm.
I've shown them like, this is where you could go. This is very
Yes.
complex. And then when they come to me with these very simplistic EDM things, I'm like, you're not going as far as you could go. And
For real.
you gotta be more open to like, maybe we should go off and then come back and go off and come back, or maybe change the time, change the key. And they get so, oh,
Yes.
my Ableton told me it's the wrong key. It's like, I purposely changed the key.
Right.
I purposely dropped it down from 120 down to 40 BPM and then came back because I wanted to get
Exactly.
something different.
It's an expressionism through sound. You know,
Yeah.
where actually you're experimenting, you're trying out new ideas, you're trying to find something that hasn't been created before. You're trying to paint a picture in people's minds that they haven't heard,
Oh yeah,
which
I
a
mean,
lot
sometimes what I
they
try to
lose
tell
sight of
people,
the
yeah.
experimental side of music.
Well, my whole thing is, I say, if you slow something down from 120 or 160 BPM down to 40 or 60, then
Mm-hmm.
you can bring in harmonics. You can bring in
Mm-hmm.
subharmonics. You can bring in like reverbs. You can bring in digital delays. You can bring in analog delays, and you can just hold a note and then fool around with the feedback. And you
Oh
can
my
do these
gosh,
very
yes.
atmospheric things that if you're going too fast, you can't do that. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
you got, and to me, it's like sometimes the music, it's the silence and what you do with that
Definitely.
silence.
Definitely.
And when you're stuck on these really fast beats, you can't do that. You don't have no room to do that. And I have some of my songs are like 60 BPM, 40 BPM, 20 BPM, because I go
Mm-hmm.
there. And in
Yes.
trying to get people to agree with that, there's a lot of people, oh, that's not a banger. Well, it's not supposed to be. but I said, why isn't it? I said, well, because I didn't want to do that. But
Exactly. I have
but
in one of my albums that's it's called Evolution of Thought. It's actually one song that's like an hour long that I split up into 7 bits because it
well,
like
that's
each
very progressive.
yeah each 7 minutes goes up one key in the scale. But where is it going with that? Yeah. Oh yeah, but I fiddle a lot with tempo in it because I was listening to a lot of what's called high tech back at that time, and that's usually like around 180 to 120 or to 220 BPM.
Yeah, yeah,
Also, I
yeah.
was listening to a lot of reggae stuff. So I switched from going at like 160 at one point where I raise up the tempo slowly, give the nice tension, build it, and then release and go to 80 BPM and start a whole reggae part of the song where it goes on that kind of vibe for the next 2 minutes
Yeah,
instead
it's
of
kind of
just
like,
always
yeah.
just making it faster and making it trying to pump people up. You got to have that tension and release of time to give people like a chance for their brains to relax and soak up the sound.
Well, that's where you get a band like the Clash, and when they went from being punks to doing an album like Sandinista, they brought
Mm-hmm.
in reggae rhythms, hip hop rhythms, new wave rhythms, and they were a punk band. That's a punk band,
Yeah.
one of the foundational punk bands. But Sandinista is now a punk record.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very eclectic record. It's got hip hop on it. It's got funk in it. It's got all these different forms. And I'm always showing people, it's like, you look at that album and tell me that you're just going to stick to like 160, 220 BPM. It's like that's not how you shouldn't be locked into that. I mean, the Clash weren't locked into that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I always like will hand like a reference to like something when I'm working with somebody. It's like, why don't you listen, Jazz and Silhouette? Why don't you go listen to Bitches Brew? Why don't you go? I'll give somebody like a piece to listen to. And then I was like, well, that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And
I'll send you a link to the song that I worked on with my friend, because he did the exact same thing for me. He gave me Echoes, and he gave me was it Chocolate Chip Trip from Tool. He had me listen to those two songs first, and then he came over to my house and we started working on music. And I was listening to those on repeat, and the song that we came up with afterwards was pretty much what was in his mind, because he knew how to find the references that would give me the ability to hear the sounds that he wanted.
Yeah, that's the thing I love about the old producers, in the old world, before we all became indie, right? And our own producers, the George Martins of the world, the great, producers like the Brian Eno's of the world, they would challenge the musicians and say, yeah, here you came, you brought me this demo. But if we use a Beatle chord, which is, the kind of concept of like, you just take that kind of bass kind of chord that would make it like a normal rock song, and you open it up to a more complicated chord structure. And then it opens up the feeling of the song. And then the use of silences, the use of effects, the backward tape looping in the studio as an instrument. Everybody has DAWs now, they can do that stuff, but then they tend to still do very simplistic stuff. When you you could go and be like Phil Spector. You could go be like, Brian Wilson. And so my whole thing is like that music history is like, you look at Brian Wilson did with Pet Sounds. I mean, where you look at like Wilco did with Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. You look at these great albums, and it's really cool. Like when you're working with musicians, I think like what we just said is like if somebody gives you where their head's at by giving you their reference point, that is probably the best way to communicate as a musician. Like a painter will probably refer you to a painting if you're working with them, to go look at some great painting and say, look at Van Gogh, look at this. You don't want to be a big head, but it's just like, you were trying to kind of get the feeling, and it's not that you're going to be Jimmy Page or you're going to be Brian Wilson or you're going to be Robert Plant or you're going to be any of these people, but it's not a bad idea to have some reference points to know where you're going.
So that way you have at least kind of a loose thought of like, this is what the sound should be like, or how I like the way he like put his soul into like this solo or and such. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean now you're gonna do note for note what Brian Wilson did, but to kind of get the feeling.
Yeah, you can capture the emotion of it.
Yeah, the emotion of it and the feeling of what you can do if you try to really well compose something. And composing doesn't have to be super tight, classically trained, musical theory. You can go into something and just try to find the honesty. I mean, I've been very big proponent of punk bands, like Green Day and the Sex Pistols, and a lot of SST stuff like Who's to Do and the Replacements and the Buzzcocks and all these, the Ramones, because of the honesty. Nirvana. I mean, Kurt Cobain was a great musician. He might not be Jimmy Page, but it was the honesty that he had and the directness in the punk aesthetic that's beautiful. And he could go and then suddenly go from this real heavy punk thing to do something acoustic that had with John Lennon. I mean, he had a lot of raw power and emotion, and when he even toned it down, it was still there.
Yes.
And that's why I think that people got to understand that you don't have to be the best guitarist, but if you go into, you don't have to be the best keyboardist or producer, but if you take some music that you're doing and you put your heart and soul in it, people will appreciate it. You don't have to have perfect pitch. You don't have to be Mariah Carey. You don't have to be Frank Sinatra. But if you
Yeah.
come into it with honesty in your heart, you don't have to have perfect pitch. You can still carry it off. You could still create a hit.
Yeah, exactly. Because people respond to the fact that you're being genuine, that you're being yourself. You're not trying to be fake or do anything, that you're not. You're actually just putting who you are into this form of sound.
Yeah, I mean that's where people like become themselves. Michael Stipe is not technically the best singer in the world, but REM became a household name because
Mm-hmm.
started to believe in himself. He believed in his art, and he created the college radio format. They gave a lot of indie bands a lot of weight because they were able to create a new sound. The way U2 made a new sound, they didn't even know how to play. They became great players, but they didn't know what they were doing when they first started. And it
Yeah.
was because they believed in what they were doing that everybody started to believe that. And then they believe themselves.
Yeah.
And that's how it can be. Is that you don't have to be the best musician in the world. You just have to be dedicated.
Exactly.
So, what are your thoughts on where you're gonna go in this Corona age? How are you gonna push your music in your social media strategies? I always like to ask about that.
Honestly, well, recently I've been starting up Patreon and stuff like that because as nice as it is to release music through labels and stuff like that, I found a lot of the work I'm pretty much doing myself when it comes to regards of, since I'm a small producer. I'll admit I'm not the greatest or really big right now, so I have to do a lot of the promo, a lot of the social media, all that stuff by myself. So I figure, why go through a label and then have to wait for them to, go through all the steps of, mastering and all that stuff, when I can literally hire my friends to do all that and the artwork for me, and then release it on my own Patreon and be able to sell my music directly to the people for cheaper than they'd be able to buy the album if the label was to try to sell it. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Because right now I'm doing a thing where I put up a song per week. It's only $3 on my Patreon, so that way you're already paying for less than a song than you would normally on iTunes. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I mean,
And it's always
Patreon
going
is
to
a
be
really
fresh
cool.
stuff. So it's like a subscription service where you're always getting new music. So that's what I'm trying to kind of push for right now.
Yeah, that and Bandcamp, SoundCloud because I've been on SoundCloud a long time. I got to be in a situation where SoundCloud's operating kind of like Bandcamp now, and and they actually have for a certain tier of the SoundCloud artists. I've been on the platform since 2008, and I hit enough numbers that I got their distribution deal. But now my stuff just goes to all the streaming sites from SoundCloud.
Nice.
And so from there, I do this stuff. I do an influence marketing, and I get more money from my influence marketing than I did from my other stuff. And then this podcast brings in money. And I just got signed. I was on a label in New York, but they put out tons of my music, but we really didn't make any money. I was on the label. Now actually, yeah, I mean, it was cool. I got 40 songs they put out. I was putting out a song a week.
I feel it, man.
And I still have a deal where I get 80% of the money from those songs forever.
Nice.
And so if I ever kick anything from my newer stuff, then it will push toward that. But I just signed with the Swedish label for a 3-song EP, and that's the way the world is. I mean, the way the industry. I do my own stuff on SoundCloud. I'll do stuff on Bandcamp. I do stuff all over the place because I'm just crazy. I write all the time, and so I've got projects, going all over the place. But that's kind of you're just kind of like an old Motown guys. We're just gonna put everything out we can.
I totally feel that though, because I feel like I write faster than the labels can put out stuff for me. Because half the time I'm just sitting on music, waiting for them to release something, and then I have to wait again, for a long time for them to release the next EP.
Oh, just because. I mean, I got this label in Europe. I just do one song for them a year because that's all they can handle. But I can't wait. So but they'll tell me well, don't put all your other stuff out. Give when this comes out, don't put any of your indie stuff out for 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after. I said, fine. It's like, okay, you tell me when you're going to put it out, and then 2 weeks before I won't put anything out, and 2 weeks after I won't put anything out. But that's it, because I go, I'll put something on Bandcamp, I'll put it on SoundCloud, I'll go put it on some other platform. I just don't care, because that's like, I write all the time, and
I totally feel that.
And I do influence marketing, and I do, like, sync licensing, and because electronic musicians, we can do stuff for advertising. I can do a 30-second jingle on my Moog and sell it and make more money on that than as the Ghost.
Mm-hmm.
but that's the way it is, and it's kind of, every musician, you have an ego. I'd rather have the Ghost make more money than my jingle, but if the jingle makes the money and makes it so I can buy another Moog, fine,
right?
But that's how it goes. But you have to be willing, and I think in this industry at this point is to be able to say, well, you know what, maybe I'll do some sync licensing, maybe I'll go do some podcasting, maybe I'll go do some other thing, I'll produce somebody else's project, or I'll pay baseline on this other project. And that's how you actually can get to a point where you actually can make money, because you open it up beyond your ego, and you say, well, I'll do something where nobody really knows I'm on this, but I'll get paid, and then you have your own project and you're trying to do that. But it's like, if you want to work and make money, sometimes you got to be willing to kind of look at other things, ways to do it.
Totally feel that.
Well, it's cool that I had you on the broadcast. And what we usually do is, if you have other music that's going to come out, we will usually interview bands 3 or 4 times. A lot of bands we've talked to, we have been on the show 3 or 4 times. And we're going to put all the links. Your Linktree is going to be on here. Your Spotify link is on here. But your Linktree is already on there, but we're putting your Spotify too. We're part of Spotify.
Oh, hell yeah.
This is going to come out within an hour. And it's going to be on 11 platforms, including iTunes, Radio Public, Overcast. And we'll send you like the iTunes and the Anchor and the Spotify link to this podcast. So we'll put this out, and we're glad that you were on Schmitt Music, and we're really excited. We think people should go out and listen to Fractal Showers, and you have a lot of albums out there besides Fractal Showers. Everybody should look at your full catalog. But that's
15 releases and counting.
Yeah. So you don't want to look at my. I've got like, you're doing really cool, but I've been so crazy. I got like 3,000 songs.
Oh, dude, you need to send me some more of your stuff.
Yeah, it's all over the place. You'll find it, like, if you go out on Spotify and you go look, you'll find, like, my last 60 songs, they're out there. Any of the streaming services you're on, and my SoundCloud is full of songs. You'll see probably in the last year I've got maybe 200-300 there. I'll send you links. But if you just go to Spotify, or you go to SoundCloud or any other streaming service that anybody has, you can get the Ghost stuff out there. But we're glad that you came on the show. We think people should listen to all your music and download it and buy it, from iTunes and from all the other stores you can get it at if you're on the other services. Because artists need to have their music supported. So instead of buying a video game, maybe buy a Schmitt record, please. Schmitt Show record. You support the artist you love. That's how you support me. You buy the record.
Definitely.
Thanks for being on the show. Thanks for being on the show. We appreciate that you're an artist out there writing your own material. We love that. That's what we live for. So thank you very much.
Thank you, bro.